Everybody, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are in here for a treat. We are going to have a conversation with the iconic and dynamic leader, Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter. We'll be discussing on the topic, does the US need a socio-political renewal? This program is organized by 4 Harvard alumni organizations, Harvard Club of Chicago, Alumnae-i Network for Harvard Women, Harvard Kennedy School Women's Network, and Harvard Women in Defense, Diplomacy and Development. So I'm going to request the presidents of each organization to introduce the organization. I'm passing the mic to Mr. Charles Bergen.
Good evening, and Dr. Slaughter, thank you so much for being with us tonight. The Harvard Club of Chicago is dedicated to fostering a strong and welcoming community of local Harvard University alums through engaging programs and events. And we try and serve the interests of Harvard in the Chicago area to promote Harvard's values of service, education, and leadership. So we're delighted to be part of this event, to co-sponsor it with the Harvard Women in Defense, Diplomacy and Development, the Harvard Kennedy School Women's Network, and the Alumnae Network for Harvard Women. I hope I said alumni correctly. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. Thank you, Dr. Slaughter, for joining us on what is a cold, late fall evening in Chicago, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. I'm passing to Theodora Skiadis to introduce the W3D and HKS WN.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure also to be welcoming you to this exciting conversation. My name is Theodora Skiadis, and I'm here pleasured to represent both W3D and HKS Womens Network. So W3D is a network, it's Harvard-wide, and we have about 2,500 members, started around 2013. To empower women in defense, diplomacy, and development, which are 3 spaces that historically underrepresent women. But also it has a dual mission of fostering peace solutions by building conversations across those 3 sectors. So the spaces of defense, development, and diplomacy are highly interactive and yet often find themselves very siloed. And because they're so interconnected, it's really important to foster conversations that talk across the 3 spaces and not in isolation. So we work both to uplift women in these spaces and also to bridge dialogue across these spaces. And then the HKS Womens Network, and I see I'm joined by Farah, a fellow board member here, and our incredible treasurer. So we are a maybe 8,000 person organization with about 50 chapters and 75 chapter leads globally. So it's a very large organization made up of women graduates of HKS. So our mission is to uplift the women graduates of HKS as they do public service work. The mission of the school is to engage in public service, to uplift the lives of people everywhere. And so what we do is we promote conversations and also engage in advocacy and action and education so that our graduates can be better equipped to advance public good globally. And we do this both globally and then also through the chapters that we have in the US and then also around the world. So it's a lot of fun and a really incredible network. So again, I'm very happy to be here with you all on behalf of those 2 organizations. Thanks, Litzy, for organizing this event.
Thank you, Theo. I'll just give a short introduction to ANHW. Alumni Network for Harvard Women was founded in 2013 by a group of Radcliffe and Harvard alumni. It's a very inclusive organization. It just wanted all Harvard women to come together on a common platform. It fosters leadership and kind of creates platforms for Harvard women to come together, network, and get to know each other. And the founders always make sure to kind of emphasize that it is not alone for women, it's also for men and anyone who would like to be part of it. But we kind of focus on supporting women's rights and kind of helping women to kind of grow professionally and personally. Now, I would like to give the floor to Ada Flores, the Secretary of ANHW, to introduce the speaker.
So before we begin our introduction, just want to make sure we're all on mute. Otherwise, I will be muting you accordingly. I am an educator by training. My name is Aida Flores. In 2012, Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter published the article, Why Women Still Can't Have It All in the Atlantic, which became the most read article in the history of the magazine. If you are like me, you remember the moment when you first came across the article. Give me a second.
Hang on a sec.
Yep.
There she goes.
If you are like me, you remember the first time you came across this article. I was sitting in a Harvard Law School class as an education student. My classmates were most worried about their future as Harvard Law grads and becoming parents. As a teenage parent, first generation college student, I couldn't relate until you revisit the past to understand the future, which I did. And I found this nugget of knowledge and wisdom, as I refer to with our teachers and students. She states, only when women wield power in sufficient numbers will we create a society that genuinely works for all women. That will be a society that works for everyone. Anne-Marie Slaughter has been paving the way for us to wield power. She's doing it again by guiding many of us to embrace in a radical honesty to move us toward renewal. Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America, a think and action tank dedicated to renewing the promise of America by bringing us closer to our nation's highest ideals. She is also a professor of Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. From 2009 to 2011, she served as a director of policy planning for the United States Department of State, the first woman to hold such position. She provides frequent commentary for both mainstream and new media and curates foreign policy news for over 140,000 followers on Twitter. Foreign Policy magazine has named her to their annual list of the top 100 global thinkers for 4 consecutive years since 2009. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Thank you. That was quite an introduction. I'm delighted to be here. We basically got enough people for a seminar.
Thank you so much, Ada. And now we can start our discussion. Dr. Slaughter, it was such a breath of fresh air to read your book, Renewal. Bringing that human connections back into the center of policy is just amazing. So if we can start our discussion with the very concept of renewal, it'll be great. Like, you define it as an approach where one should look backward and forward at the same time. A way in which one should embrace a past without overlooking it, at the same time, trying to create a new future. You also differentiate it with the concepts of restoration and reinvention. So can you just elaborate the definition for us?
So Lindsay, that was an excellent definition. I think you captured the heart of it. The place to start perhaps is just to say that I do think words matter. As the former law professor that I am, always thinks of Justice Holmes' famous quote where he says, the word is the skin of a living thought. And how we think obviously determines how we see the world and how we act. So the word matters to me. And I thought a lot about it in context of my own journey, because the first part of the book is really a lot about my own journey as a leader, but then thinking about organizations and the country. And as you say, what makes it powerful is renewal does look backward and forward at the same time. There's the re part looking backwards and the new part looking forwards. And so it's about change, right? You're making something new, but you're making something new again. Which means obviously there was something to start with and there was a journey there, and now you are recommitting, you're changing, because I believe in change, but I don't believe in complete reinvention. I write in the book that, America is the land of reinvention. Everything promises a whole new you. I've tried every diet book in the world. I don't believe in a whole new you. But I do believe in real change. And I think it has to start by looking backward. with what I call radical honesty. And Aida made reference to that, where we stare our past, our flaws, our mistakes, we stare that in the face as unflinchingly as possible. And indeed, I talk about running toward the criticism. And through that process and accepting that, you don't then just sort of wallow in guilt or self-hatred. You then use that process of honesty and strength and courage to then think about what can you build that is new, still based on that foundation. And that is something I think I went through, but I deeply believe the country needs to go through. I'm an optimist. I think we can, in fact, build a new country together, or a renewed country, because we're renewing our commitment to the ideals that were set forth in some of the documents at our founding. And we've always fallen short, and we always will fall short. But at our best, we've taken those ideals seriously and really moved toward them. So it's that double-faced process that is renewal.
So I'm going to just take it from what you said, like run towards the criticism is like was a very powerful message you've been kind of repeating in your personal narratives. And just to quote from your book, you were asking openly in the book that, do we as a nation has the courage to look ourselves in the mirror, past and present, as honestly as possible, to renew our ideals and recommit to our best selves without hiding from our worst deeds and impulses. And you emphasize that facing the gap between what we see and what others see in us is a path of growth for people, but also nations. Now, based on these parameters, how would you assess the US today? Is an honest assessment taking place in the country? If yes, by whom? Is it widespread or restricted to, some small circles or echo chambers?
So I do think that we are facing our past more than I have seen at any other point in my lifetime. And I use the description of Monticello. So again, I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia. When you live in Charlottesville, Virginia, you basically think Mr. Jefferson is just going to walk around the corner at any moment. Everybody calls him Mr. Jefferson. And, Monticello, when I was growing up, was a shrine. I went to it on so many field trips, I could have given you a tour. But it was only Jefferson, the drafter of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, the president, Jefferson, the Secretary of State, Jefferson, the inventor, the farmer, the absolute polymath and sort of Renaissance man. You heard nothing. I don't think I ever heard growing up anything about enslaved people at Monticello. And yet, as Clint Smith writes in his book, How the Word is Passed, which is a history of slavery, his opening chapter is Monticello Plantation, because it was a plantation. And of course, all that Jefferson did was enabled by some 300 enslaved men, women, and children, including some of his own children. And now when you go, I'm sure there are people who are still unhappy, and I'm sure there are people who are unhappy who love Jefferson and who think, and people on the other side who thinks he still gets away with too much. But it is an effort to tell you at every point what Monticello was like from Jefferson's perspective and his white family's perspective, but also from his Black family's perspective and from the enslaved men and women. And so that to me is certainly a reckoning. You couldn't have imagined something like that growing up. You couldn't, when I was growing up, nobody would have believed you if you talked about Sally Hemings, and Annette Gordon-Reed didn't publish her book about Sally Hemings till the 1990s. The Confederate statues coming down, again, Richmond, I wouldn't have believed it. So there are many ways in which we are facing our history. I think there's still many Americans who are really afraid that if we face our history honestly, there won't be anything good left. And they're fighting like crazy to preserve a vision of the country that they love, that they it is their country. And that's where I want to say, look, actually, that's something, if we can do this, and other countries have, South Africa and Germany and Japan, although a little less so, and often when forced to, but if we can pull this off, if we can say on Thanksgiving's coming up and we still celebrate Thanksgiving, but we also recognize if you are of Native American heritage, there is nothing to give thanks about. And look that in the face. I mean, in fact, Randy Kennedy, Harvard law professor, once came into a class that I was teaching of 150 foreign students, because I taught the introduction to American law. And he came in and he said, the history of the United States is a history of genocide and crimes against humanity. And this was 1995. Every foreign students didn't know what to say, and there weren't American students. But today, I mean, then I kind of gasped. Today, I would say, yes, that's right. But that's not our whole history. So I think we're getting there. I think there's a tremendous amount of resistance. And part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to find a way to express my love of the country and my belief in the country at the same time as we exercise this kind of radical honesty.
Your love of your country is very evident because you are touching on a very important population that has always been overlooked. You talk about care economy. You know, like you emphasize a lot on care economy and investing in the infrastructure of care. You know, it's one of the invisible economy in the country or around the world. You know, the financial worth of caregivers are often taken for granted. You mentioned in your book that, activist Agent Pooh often says that care is a work that made other work possible. So can you talk about how investing in the infrastructure of care will contribute towards a socioeconomic renewal in the US?
Oh, let me count the ways. I mean, to begin with, if we had a proper infrastructure of care, we would see many, many more caregivers, still majority women, although a fair number of men, able to use their talents to the fullest in the workplace. And in fact, women's participation in the labor force is going down. And at one point, we were actually behind Japan in terms of global rankings. And that is because you don't have family leave or paid leave, right? So often when people have children, they simply have to drop out. We don't have an infrastructure of childcare that doesn't have to be and almost certainly won't be state sponsored. There should be a state alternative. There should be a public option. But of course, the actual ways we give care can range from the family to family-based care to commercial, sort of private sector care. But we need to have enough affordable, high-quality care for everyone, for children. Childcare for two people costs more than the cost of rent in all 50 states, which is just astounding. So in part, you're freeing up people who do need time and space for care, and it's some of the most rewarding work we do, and we're investing in others. And then at the other end of life, similarly, and of course, many people are caring for their parents. As I age, I want to know that I hope I'll be able to age in place as long as possible. I hope that when I need care, that's going to be an educated, compassionate person who is paid enough to actually want to do that work and to do it well and has the ability to care for their own. So there are huge economic benefits, but equally social benefits, because my proposition, and I write about it in Renewal, is our economy is based on half human beings, right? This assumption that we're all rational, self-interested interest maximizers. We are, in part. I'm very competitive and very ambitious, but we're also people who need to connect to others, and care is one of the most important ways that we do that. It could be care for your community, and it certainly doesn't have to be a biological family, but it would strengthen us immeasurably as a country.
We'll come back to the connection-based, themes a little later. But since there are 3 women's organizations here, I have to ask this, because you mentioned, I think in one of the interviews, probably, you were mentioning that when you advocate for care economy, it's not maybe perceived as so glamorous as focusing on the classic feminist approach towards career and empowerment of women to conquer the world. Can you share those gray areas with us?
Yes. And that was a real journey as well. When I wrote my Atlantic article in 2012, Why Women Still Couldn't Have It All, in the first place, even writing something like that, and I didn't mean that women couldn't have it all. I meant that in the way our society is structured, you had to be superhuman, self-employed, or extremely wealthy to make it work. But at that point, I would say I was a classic career feminist, right? Well, I thought that the principal barriers to gender equality were the discrimination still of many different kinds, the glass ceiling, and yes, not making room for care in the workplace. And I wrote about thinking about a career as a set of intervals rather than a straight ladder up, which, given how long we live, there's plenty of time for that. And I talked about, valuing, a mother or a father who's getting up at 4 a.m. to pack lunches is just as valuable an employee as somebody who's getting up early to go train for a marathon. But I was a career feminist. And then I spent 3 years researching a book and thinking really hard about gender equality. And I came out still believing in careers and still believing we have to fight discrimination and encouraging women, to take their seat at the table, all the things that Sheryl Sandberg says, and be strong. But I really believe we won't get to gender equality until we value the work that women have traditionally done of care just as much as the work that men have traditionally done. So my mother's work in building our family, which is a lot of work, was just as important as my father's work as a lawyer. And I couldn't do the things I do if I didn't have the support system of my family. Further, you're investing in other people. I mean, when I look at my siblings and actually our whole family, I think that is enormously rewarding work. It's just that your reward is coming through the growth of another, as I might be a teacher or a mentor, than it is nurturing ourselves. So I now strongly believe that we need to value traditional women's work, but the last step is that it can't just be women's work. We need as many men at home or in caregiving as women in the office. And at that point, we will make room for both. Of course, now we're all working from home, so it's all in the same place, but
it's all, yeah, multitasking at the same time.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I'm just going to go to another point that you've mentioned in your book, like, social infrastructure and risk-taking and innovation. Like, I mean, you just mentioned that, we need to have that safety nets for people to kind of unleash their potential, but not just alone for women, right? You talk about a renewed approach towards risk-taking, like many ordinary people, I mean, not the privileged group, which may have the luxury to take risks, but ordinary people may not necessarily take risk because of lack of safety nets to support them, the uncertainties that they face, like, day-to-day survival or health insurance or, so many other priorities that come your way in your daily life. So you really talk about kind of investing in social infrastructure that would enable people to unleash their potential and kind of bring out more innovation, and which will create a new ecosystem of entrepreneurs and innovators who could focus entirely on ideas and creativity without fearing failures and so on. So can you talk a little more about that social infrastructure, risk-taking, and the innovative outcomes it can unleash?
Now, that's another personal journey to start with. I say in the book that I've given a commencement address many times, generally more at high school than college, occasionally at colleges, that sort of take risks, take time, and take care. It works for 10 minutes if you're sitting through a commencement address. But I would always start with take risks, And I would say, it's really important in your lives that you, it's not just follow your heart. You've got to earn a living, but that you're willing to break norms, that you're willing to try to do what you want to do, and even if you can't quite see how to do it. And the example I would always use was that I had been incredibly focused and driven through college, and then I got to law school. I had mapped out, I think in high school, that if you wanted to go into foreign policy, you needed to go to law school, and you needed to go to a big law firm, and then you needed to work for a partner who was going to go in and out of the State Department, and then you would go in and out of the State Department, and then someday then you'd rise. I had it all mapped out. And I went to Harvard Law School, and I went to work for Simpson Thacher, which was a big law firm where Cy Vance, who'd been Secretary of State, was the senior partner. And I got to know some of the partners, and I was all set, except I hated the work. And in fact, the people at Simpson Thacher told me later, they knew I was going to be an academic, but I didn't know I was going to be an academic. I would have told you the last thing in the world that I ever want to do is to teach. I mean, that's like writing books. I want to be in the world of action. So I spent 4 years hanging out at Harvard Law School, working for Larry Tribe and Hal Scott and Abe Shays. I re-enrolled in a PhD program at Oxford because I couldn't figure out how to have any status if you're hanging around a university. And there were 4 really tough years. I'd kind of fallen off the track. My marriage fell apart. It was really hard. And then finally, I sort of found myself on the law teaching market with a lot of support from professors. So I used to describe this as taking risks. And, in the end, I ended up in a career I really loved. And of course, later then did end up back in the State Department. When I went through a crisis in 2017, which is where the book opens and describes this journey, I was a 59-year-old woman who was running a nonprofit of about $30 million a year. I had left the academy, so I was no longer tenured. I'd actually given up tenure. And believe me, in the months of 2017 during this crisis, I kept thinking, what possessed me? But there was a very good chance that I was going to lose my job. And if I lost my job based on the accusation that was being leveled against me, that I'd given into funder pressure to shape a substantive content, I wouldn't have gotten another job, certainly not in the academy. I'm sure I would have gotten something, but I suddenly became much more conservative at that moment, right? Because suddenly, when I was in my 20s, the worst thing that could have happened to me was I was not going to get a job, and I was going to go home and live with my parents for a while and regroup, right? Because I'm affluent and I had those options. And in that setting, I was willing to take all sorts of risks. 30 years later, not so much. And then I started researching risk. And I think it's obvious when you think about it, but it seems paradoxical. It is much easier to take risks when you have a baseline of security. I don't mean that you're not going to fail. I don't mean that you're not going to actually have a lot of bumps. But if you think losing your job means losing your house, you are not going to, be the innovator. You're not going to drop out of college and go be an entrepreneur. And it's telling that all the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, the first round of venture capital is the friends and family round. They're not going to fall that far. So what I then argue is if the United States wants to raise a whole new generation of entrepreneurs, which is something we pride ourselves on, we need to give them a baseline of security. That if you want more risk taking, you provide more security. And then there's sort of this zone where you're not going to fall all the way down, but you're not given so much security that there's no reason to take risks and reap the rewards. And the last thing I'll say is the research shows women take just as many risks as men. In fact, they're more inclined to take social risks than men, but they do take risks differently. That's what the research shows.
Busting a common myth. Thank you for that research. I'm just going from topic to topic in the interest of time. So the next is like you also, I was really fascinated by what you said in your book, investing in the intelligence and capacity of our people should be the cornerstone of our national security. Spending tax dollars in education, shaping young brains, helping them to grow into full potential, and so on. Now, and you also say that if we have the political will, we have resources for both national security as well as social infrastructure. You also shared that you would have never dared to say it in a national security forum before. So what made you evolve and state it so assertively now? And how can United States pragmatically balance national security priorities and investment in people?
So one reason I dare to say it now is I'm a lot older and I care less about sort of other reactions, but that's not entirely true. So the statement that I said, I believe that I wouldn't have said is that early education is actually a national security issue. And by early education, I mean 0 to 5. I don't distinguish between childcare and early ed. It's just a question of the mix of care. It is a national security issue to start with because we are shaping young brains. What we know now from neuroscience is those first 5 years, particularly the first 3, it's not what you're teaching children, it's that you're teaching them at all, that you're engaging them. That actually determines the shape of their brains, the number of neurons that they will have, synapses that they will have, and that determines how much they can learn for the rest of their lives. So if you want to have a nation of healthy, productive, intelligent people who can compete in a national economy and a global economy, that's your best investment. And there's just reams of research showing that if you invest, you also pay many fewer social costs down the road, whether that's in hospitalization or incarceration, all because you are really creating people who are better equipped to navigate life. So I believe that. I think it is certainly possible to have both. It's not that I believe we shouldn't have a defense budget, of course not, but particularly the way war is evolving, where it's mostly drones and droids and far more, and probably in space as well. There are ways to balance those costs, and it doesn't cost that much if you look at our defense budget to assure early education for everyone. But what I was saying there is, I never would have dared say that in a national security context, because it would have just gotten me laughed out of the room. And one of the things I'm arguing for in terms of just the kind of society we need is to actually be able to take multiple interests into account. And actually the Pentagon does. The Pentagon does a great job with early education, and they understand it. But that it would be a far better defense debate if, instead of saying guns here and butter there, we actually thought about what it means to invest in our people and what that will do for our economy, but also, frankly, for our national security.
But do you feel they will be, more receptive to the idea today? Because, if they may have laughed at it like a couple of years before. Do you think it will be any different today?
Oh, no, I do. I actually think, I think the argument that investing in childcare and early education is smart and saves money down the road domestically, yes, that argument has definitely gotten through. It's a large part of what the administration argues for in the Build Back Better package. But I think also, I think as more women are in the national security establishment, but also men. This is not just women, this is also generational, where men who are much more engaged in child rearing and who are thinking about, again, as we know from the neuroscience, that you are shaping that brain, it is an argument that I think is much more heard.
Thank you. I'll just ask one more question and open it to Q&A. You talked about human connection, like we need to build new economic and social systems based on human connection. You kind of talk about, individualism. I mean, US is a individualistic society, but you are kind of really challenging the foundation and showing the importance of human connection. And you talk about replacing home economics with sapient integra, which actually means a being who finds happiness and well-being not only as a function of a person's individual state, but of the state of others whom that person is connected with. Can you talk about it? Is it, can we realistically bring that philosophy into the American society?
So let me start with rugged individualism. I have a chapter in the book called Rugged Interdependence. And what I do is to go back to the transcendentalists, to the pioneers, going across the Great Plains, to the origins of rugged individualism, which was a speech by Herbert Hoover in 1926 or 1928, actually, when he was running for president, but based on a book that he wrote in 1921. And in each of these places, oh, and I also talk about Frederick Jackson Turner's and the Spirit of the Frontier at the Chicago Exposition, so in 1891. Each of those stories is partially true, but as I point out, Emerson's wife Lydian wrote a wonderful little satire on the transcendentalists, where she pointed out that for all their self-reliance, they came home to a warm dinner. They expected that their houses would be taken care of. And of course, Thoreau's mother brought him food and did his laundry when he was at Walden. So I just retell the story from the perspective of multiple people. And similarly, if you read all the sort of wagon trains and the pioneers going westward ho, and these rugged men and women, who conquered the frontier. I spent a lot of time reading women's journals from trips across the plains. And the emphasis there is entirely on interdependence, right? First, on everybody else in the wagon train. It was essentially a community moving, and they circled the wagons. That's where we get the phrase from. And a lot of these women would then describe settling and saying, we depended completely on our neighbors and on a culture of mutual assistance, because how else would they? So I talk about that as rugged interdependence. And then, even with Herbert Hoover's speech, you have Franklin Roosevelt just 10 years later talking about a very different concept of what the country should look like. And Herbert Hoover was really arguing that, the Europeans were socialist and we were individual. We are both. And the other thing I'll say is, we started with Anglo-Saxon WASP culture, although not just WASP, we had all different religions. But as we become more and more diverse, so African-American culture, huge emphasis on solidarity. Their story is south to north, both with the Great Migration and the Underground Railroad. But, Indian American, Hispanic American, Asian American, these are all cultures that really are strongly family based. And that's part of our culture now too. So I think we have both. And to go to your point about Homo economicus, for those of you who remember your Econ 101 and 102, it's the Homo economicus, or is economic man. And of course, economists know that is an archetype. It's but it's that perfect, as I said, interest maximizing, rationally calculating being. I talk about sapiens integra. It's a concept I developed with Hilary Cottam, who's a social designer and thinker in Britain, who's actually done work redesigning social institutions, just to say we need to take account of the whole person, as I said earlier. We can do this. There are indexes, the Social Progress Index, that measures lots more than GDP and unemployment. And indeed, the Commerce Department now is interested in what other measures can we take to take account of the whole person. And in Britain, you have a whole movement toward the well-being economy, or donut economics from Kate Raworth, where she says, we've got to have enough to live well, but we can't live so well that we can't be on the planet, and we have to invest in each other. So I actually think, whether people use sapiens integra or not, the idea of an economy and a society based on whole people is not such a stretch.
Wow, I wish we had more and more time to I have a list of questions with me, but I think our attendees are waiting to have a discussion with you. So we will open it up to Q&A. If anyone would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand feature or share your questions via chat. I can see the HCC president, Mr. Charles Bergen, nodding his head. So I pass the mic to him first.
Thanks. Dr. Slaughter, I find this, the historical parallels interesting, but I was going to ask about a slightly different topic, which is we're now in an age of new monopolies. And we have these giant economic engines that even during the pandemic have gathered momentum and gathered force to the point where we don't have a national space program anymore. We have private space programs that might rent equipment to the government. Do you see that there are clearly parallels to the golden age after the Gilded era?
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a big difference there. The Gilded, after the Civil War, where you had the rise of the monopoly in technology that really took us through the 20th century.
Exactly.
What effect do you see these new monopolies having? And to what extent are there things that we as citizens might do in response, if anything?
So I think you're right. I think we do need to rev up antitrust law, particularly probably on mergers and acquisitions. I mean, Facebook wouldn't be where it was if it hadn't been able to gobble up Instagram and WhatsApp. And basically the minute that you see a competitor coming, you just buy them. So there's lots that we can do with antitrust laws. I'm not convinced that just breaking them up makes sense, because I remember breaking up AT&T, and so Verizon makes me just as angry as Ma Bell used to. I mean, they've got a monopoly, at least around here. But there's a great deal that we can and must do around changing the business model, around forcing interoperability, so that you remember, if you change your cell phone, you keep your number, right? That was a big, big change. So similarly, many of us would use something other than Facebook, or even Google's a little harder, but if you could take all your contacts with you, right? And if these different technologies were interoperable, in terms of basically making it impossible for them to collect data on you, which is the business model, right? That everything's free except you are selling your data, or you're exchanging your data in return. In Europe, they already have stronger regulation, but they're moving toward regulation where the default will be that they cannot collect data on you unless you specifically authorize it. And that's easy to do, because right now in Europe, you have to go through, like 5 or 6 things. Nobody's going to do that when they're just trying to get to a website. We can borrow a lot of the European regulation and adapt it. We can certainly, as a political matter, make clear that the dynamism of our economy and our privacy and our ability to own that data, right? The data is like the new oil. We should own it. We should not give it away. So there's a lot that can be done. I think the Biden administration is going to try to do a lot. It runs into national security issues because big tech says, well, if you do that, we can't compete with China. I don't think that's true, but there's going to be a lot of fighting.
Yeah, and just one follow-up sort of with that is, do you think the concentration of economic power in a smaller number of hands has an impact in terms of going forward with some of the things that you want to do as the renewal project?
I do. No, I absolutely do. And it's ironic because on the other hand, it's easier to start a business. In first place, you can have your accountant, you can have your HR, all of that, you can sort of put together. So it's easier to start a business, but good luck selling if you're not on Amazon. So there are many ways in which curbing that power, just as we did do at the turn of the 20th century, is just like cutting down the big trees so that there's room for others to grow. So yes.
Okay, I'll let somebody else have a turn, but I have other things too, but let's see how we go.
Thank you. Rachel George?
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Slaughter. It was such a joy to read your book. I found it really useful, and this conversation is such a treat. In reading your book, something I particularly appreciated is how you spoke to sort of women's and people's careers in foreign policy and how they navigate different sectors. And since Harvard, I've gone into academia, and so I was wondering if you could speak to how you see the role of academia in global affairs, renewing America, and in foreign policy.
So I had a whole part in the book that I had to cut out because it was just too much on overhauling a lot of our higher education system. So I believe in academia strongly. I've spent a lot of my life there. I do think that the current system of relatively few tenured professors and a growing, sort of cloud of adjuncts in many universities is unfair and wrong. I believe in tenure. There are things I've definitely written because I was tenured that I wouldn't have written otherwise, but we need to overhaul how long it takes to get it, to allow much more room for parents, to be not to be on the tenure track created for men who had caregivers at home. We do need to make much more room for other credentials for teachers, particularly in a world where things change so fast. The idea that, a practitioner is an adjunct and somebody who is only in the world of research can be tenured. No, we need much more cross-disciplinary work. I'm a big fan of what Arizona State University is doing. And their mantra, they have all these cross-disciplinary programs, but their mantra is the prestige of a university should be measured by not by how many people it excludes, but how many people it includes. Now that isn't necessarily true of a private university, but it is of a public university. It should not, University of Virginia publishes its admission statistics and takes pride in the fact that it's only taking 12% of people. That shouldn't be our model. And finally, in addition to getting a hold of student debt, we need universities to publish much more data about what kind of education their graduates are getting and what kind of jobs they're getting. That's all from the point of view of the system. From the point of view of individuals, I think we need to make it much easier, not necessarily to leave the academy as I did, but to move in and out, right? That again, I think academic research is enhanced by practice, and I definitely think practice is enhanced by academic research. So I would like to see, I'd overhaul the State Department so that there were 5 to 7 year tours of duty, and I would definitely like to see some academics doing that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Liz?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. Dr. Slaughter, I am just blown away by your new book and your thinking. Since leaving Harvard, I've been involved in climate change. I cannot believe this, for over 30 years. It's really disconcerting to see all our PowerPoint slides coming to life and faster than we thought. I'm just curious. In our research, we have shown things are much worse than what reaches the public. We've also seen that women really take on problems in a very different way in the climate change arena. It's also, I think, that the current political structures of the world don't give us much confidence that they're going to be able to deal with this existential threat of climate change. I'm wondering, in all your thinking, and I think you are one of the most brilliant thinkers around today, what do you think we can do using kind of your new model of leadership and renewal to maybe address this intractable problem that we see addressing climate change, and especially with regard to women? I understand this is not your area of expertise, but your thinking really is needed in this field.
Well, thank you for that question. I did write a piece over the weekend in the New York Times. It was published in the Sunday Review, where I effectively said, what good is it that we beat China, if we're going under? if the world is becoming less and less habitable, and if we're ravaged by pandemics and we kill off biodiversity. And I really believe that. I called for a people-centered politics rather than state-centered. I think there are many ways to collaborate with other nations and with lots of other groups. States are just not going to get us there. So what I'm arguing, we can meet in COP forever. We're going to go under. So there has to be ways to marshal the kinds of movements, frankly, that we are seeing among young people. I think, though, it is going to demand something more like a revolution, in the sense of people demonstrating for a different approach to both national and global politics. And I do frankly think it is my children's generation, the millennials, and people like you who've seen this for a long time. But it has to cut across political lines. And the only way I see that happening is through young people, because they're the ones who are really saying, we're going to live in this world, and you are destroying it. So, I'm very scared. I truly am, that, as you say, the Gulf Stream could change, and we really would find ourselves, at least at the level of New York and Europe, back in an ice age. And so I don't know what it takes to change people's mind, other than a kind of mass movement that people gradually start that people start to join. I wish I had a better answer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. Barbara?
Good evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Slaughter, for being here and for speaking with us today. My question is about what higher institutions like Harvard can do to help prepare people for the Foreign Service and to get them excited about this possibility in working in foreign policy. I went to the college and I didn't hear much about it at all. I heard all about Goldman and Morgan Stanley, and I myself was at Lehman Brothers as a summer analyst, but if I had known more about this path, I definitely would have pursued it. So what can these institutions do to help diversify the pool of applicants for the Foreign Service and civil service? Because we really need to reflect different groups of people, different ways of thinking, different races and ethnicities and backgrounds. So thank you.
That's another great question, and something actually New America is very engaged in trying to create a policy ecosystem that looks like the country. So a policy ecosystem are, internships. And so that's where you start, either in government or with a think tank or with a lobby organization or an NGO, and then going in and out of government, as you say, and the sort of whole way, the support system for our government and government itself in Washington is very white. It does not look like the country. And we can't, we're going to be a plurality nation in this century, and we cannot be governed by people who don't reflect the population. So it is a hard problem. And there are a lot of people working on it in terms of getting, hiring different people, much more diverse people into think tanks, into government. I think, though, your question about the Foreign Service and undergrads, Harvard could do a lot, but not unless the Foreign Service itself changes. I just don't know any really talented young people who want to sign up for a 30-year career that is absolutely in lockstep. You start 2 years of visa stamping, and then you have your first 3-year rotation, and then you go somewhere else. And God forbid that you should be promoted above your rank. Because I was in the State Department. If you try to do that, they say, oh, this would be very bad for that person's career because they'll make everybody else mad. I wouldn't sign up for that. I would sign up to represent my country as a diplomat or in the various ways the State Department lets you do, but only if that wasn't going to be all of my career, and if I could actually rise and bring other expertises to bear. So and there are a lot of us pushing on really reforming the State Department. I think a place like Harvard ought to talk about national security careers, development careers, defense careers, I mean, to your 3D organization, where you talk about what I used to talk about at what was then the Wilson School. I'd say you want to be a tri-sector athlete. If you're interested in the environment, you ought to work sometime in government. That could be local, that could be national, it could be international, sometime in the private sector, because there's a lot of change that can be made there, and sometime in an NGO. And you will learn different cultures and different vocabularies, and you'll make different contacts. And that's the kind of flexible knowledge that will let you take a variety of jobs. So if I were Harvard, I would not be training people for very specific things. I'd be grouping together, as I said, diplomatic careers, or even broader than that, sort of global careers, and then, you know, development, within that, development, diplomacy, and defense.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? You can either use a chat or raise your hand. But I just want to touch upon something that you mentioned right now. I know you know, in the last chapter, you were talking about your aspiration, like, you know, not really aspiration, within the next 4 years, in 2026, how you kind of envision the American, you know, landscape to be, political landscape to be. Would you like to talk a little bit about it? Plurality of nation and so on.
Yeah, the coda of the book, and it borrows from Langston Hughes's poem, which I put at the beginning, "Oh, let America be America again." And it says, America, the country that has never been yet must be. And that is the way I think about the country. We've never achieved, you know, our ideals fully, but we believe that it must be. And I imagine my version of what would be happening in 2026. Everything from, I imagine that the George W. Bush Foundation and the Obama Foundation come together and create a commission to identify 56 new founders to match the founding fathers. Because Obama said that John L. Lewis was a founder in his eulogy. And I thought, you know, there have been lots of founders. And if we simply come together politically, we could identify 56. Is that going to be perfect? No, but it's sort of happenstance that the first 56 were there as well. But then I talk much more broadly about how you can use really 5 years from now, if you go through the end of 2026, as a catalyst for both reckoning and repairing, but also honoring and healing, and sort of upping our ambitions. I'll give you just one. By 2026, imagine if 26 states had adopted ranked choice voting. I believe deeply we need a multi-party democracy, not 10 parties, but at least the 4 that we had in the 20th century, where we had, you know, conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans. And, you know, liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats were basically the same people, and they could make lots of compromises. If we had ranked choice voting across in all those states, we have them now in New York in Maine and Alaska, but it's going to be on the ballot in Illinois. We could then have third and fourth parties without being spoilers. And it incentivizes politicians to pitch not only to the base, but to the people that they want to choose them as a second choice, not just a first choice. So I imagine that there are lots of groups working on this, and we absolutely can do it. Let's challenge ourselves to a big goal by 2026. I am actually working with a whole group of people on a project called Us at 250, or US at 250, that is talking about new national narratives that will be producing big events, but also will be partnering with as many organizations as possible across the political spectrum to challenge themselves to make real change by 2026. It's, you know, the end of our first quarter millennium, the beginning of our second quarter millennium, Americans will reflect the world. There will not be a majority white culture. And who are we going to be, and how will we live up to those ideals? I believe we can, but I think 2026 is a great catalyst and hinge moment to try to get us out of where we are right now.
It would be great if you could let us know how Howard alumni groups could support you to bring that narrative. We would be happy to kind of mobilize our alumni group and kind of, work.
I will
support you.
remember that because we're about to roll it out publicly.
Okay. The last question, Mr. Charles Bergen has the last question.
You're on mute.
I think I'm okay now. So my question actually follows up on what you were just saying. We see that you've been very involved in starting up the New America enterprise, the New America.
We just call it New America.
Okay, I'm trying to think of the right noun to put with that. New America is both a think tank and an action tank. What role do you think that organization or others like it can play in transforming America?
Well, I think New America can be a real catalyst, and we're working, we're incubating US at 250. I have spent a lot of time changing a think tank, which if you just think about the imagery, it's a bunch of smart people in a tank in Washington coming up with answers that often never even get implemented. But even when they do, they're often very far from the people the policies are intended to serve. So what we are pioneering is human-centered design and data feedback, a sort of software development approach to figuring out what works in cities and communities across the country, and then lifting that up and creating policy. But it's like you implement the solution before you put it into law. And I think we're also really pushing very big ideas, this infrastructure of care, a multi-party democracy, technology that serves democracy and strengthens it rather than weakening it, a whole vision of education from birth to workforce and lifelong learning. I think organizations like mine can push big ideas. We can be the hubs of coalitions, and I think we will have more impact through partners than trying to compete with our fellows. And again, we can push not policy, but a broader way of solving public problems. Policy is one way, but if you're in the Kennedy School, if I were designing the Kennedy School curriculum today, I would say you need as many community organizers as you need policy analysts, and you need to be figuring out how to start with the lived experience of the people the policies are meant to serve. And I will say, because it is that time of the season, you can help by going on our website and giving us a donation, but also, frankly, just as importantly, signing up for, we have a weekly newsletter called The Thread. That is kind of a wonderful, it's politics, equity, and culture.
Great. No, thank you very much. I think everybody on this call is interested in what we can do. And I think everybody on this call most of them are sort of young enough to still pick a path. So I don't know. I don't know if we have to wrap it, let's see or not, but this has been phenomenal from my point of view. And let me say on behalf of the Harvard Club of Chicago, we really appreciate you taking the time, coming to speak with us and our members and answer our questions, and frankly, be an inspiration to so many of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it. It really was like a seminar.
Great seminar.
Any closing remarks, Dr. Slaughter, for us?
No, I would just, again, I've enjoyed it. It's a spirited conversation, and I wish you a good night and a very happy Thanksgiving. And try to talk to your relatives who disagree with you in a way that suspends judgment and you hear them. So read Adam Grant's Think Again, but we need to do that individually if we're ever going to do it as a country. See you all later.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, and hope you enjoyed it and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.